Good evening and welcome. My name is Ian McFarland. I'm the chair of the Divinity Faculty Board, and it's my delight to welcome you here this evening for this festive event, celebrating the inaugural lecture of Douglas Hedley, who studied philosophy and theology at Keble College, Oxford, and subsequently pursued doctoral studies in the philosophy faculty at the University of Munich. After receiving his doctorate in 1992, he went on to a postdoctoral fellowship awarded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft for work on 17th century theology and the Cambridge Platonists. Thence, a brief stint at the University of Nottingham, from whence he came to Cambridge in 1996, where he has been happily ever since. Although, in his time here, he has held a number of distinguished fellowships and visiting professorships elsewhere, including Directeur d'études immédiates at the École pratique des hautes études in the Sorbonne, the Alan Richardson Fellow at the Theology Department at Durham University, Teep Lecturer in India, Templeton Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And, of course, while here, he's also been involved in many activities. Most currently, his role as principal investigator on the AHRC grant, The Cambridge Platonists at the Origins of Enlightenment, Text, Debates, and Reception, 1650-1730. Over the course of his career, Professor Hedley has published widely, but he is doubtless most well known for his trilogy on imagination. Living Forms of the Imagination in 2008 offered a philosophical and theological exploration of imagination and religious belief. Then in 2011, Sacrifice Imagined, Violence, Atonement, and the Sacred drew on a wide variety of resources to appraise the relationship between violence, the submission of the individual will, and the sacred. And finally, most recently in 2016, the iconic Imagination explored the link between imagination and the metaphysics of image. The Judgment of Religious Studies review on this final volume of the series could well be applied to the whole trilogy. Quote, "This is a book that constantly challenges us with reminders of possibilities for thinking beyond the narrow range of much recent philosophy and theology. Impressively learned but highly readable, it does not merely discuss imagination, but stimulates it as well." We look forward to just such stimulation this evening as Professor Hedley presents his lecture on Devout Contemplation and Sublime Fancy, the Cambridge Platonists and their legacy for the philosophy of religion. Join me in welcoming him.
Many thanks, Professor McFarland. Ladies and gentlemen, it's customary for an inaugural lecture to express a debt of gratitude to one's predecessors and a declaration of intent. And this afternoon will be no exception. This afternoon I will give you an account of the main tenets of the Cambridge Platonists, ask a question: are they merely a historiographical construction, or do they constitute a living tradition? Discuss the legacy of the Cambridge Platonists, then consider Platonism viewed by them as systematic metaphysics and a way of life, and I shall finish with some words about contemplation, imagination, and the sense of the sublime. Let me start with the source of my title. You may be surprised that it comes from this fellow, Edward Gibbon, discussing Boethius. He says that in the education of Boethius, who attempted to reconcile the strong and subtle sense of Aristotle with the devout contemplation and sublime fancy of Plato. And I will endeavor to expand on the reception of this devout contemplation and sublime fancy in the Cambridge Platonists. So here we have Benjamin Whichcote and Peter Story in magnificent windows, as you can see, in Emmanuel College. When I, in 1996, arrived in Cambridge to give a lecture for my interview in the philosophy of religion, I nervously presented my interest in the Cambridge Platonists. At the end of my presentation, the then Norris Hulse professor sniffed and remarked, somewhat disconcertingly, "Yes, but in Cambridge we are embarrassed about the Cambridge Platonists." It is most satisfying to report that 20 years later we obtained a major AHRC grant to edit the works of this school, and we have a team in Cambridge to research and edit this remarkable group of writers. Even then, these thinkers appealed to me as a paradigm of philosophical activity, a vibrant combination of hermeneutic and speculative interests, open to the great issues of the age, while fully cognizant of the rich history of the subject. The Cambridge Platonists are the most important Platonic school between the Renaissance and the Romantic period, and yet never properly edited, though much studied. They exerted an influence on Leibniz, Locke, Newton, Shaftesbury, Berkeley, Reid, Hume, Coleridge, and the German idealists. Many of their ideas, arguments, and problems are currently the focus of attention in the philosophy of religion and in theology, especially issues of atheism and religion, nature, the ecological question, tolerance and politics, the foundation of ethics. But even though they were drawing on a Platonic perspective, many of the problems they are addressing only emerge with the new science, or with other aspects of modern society, such as pluralism, even the question of women. Here we have Lady Anne Conway, the heroine pupil of Henry Moore, Damaris Cudworth, Ralph Cudworth's brilliant daughter, was herself a great friend of John Locke and would be visited by Lord Shaftesbury and discuss philosophy together. So here we have not just the origins of philosophy in the English language, but the origin of women philosophers writing. And for this group, Platonism is a system of thought, but it's a flexible structure, one designating not just an intellectual paradigm, but also a way of life. Now, it's often said that Hegel is the founder of the philosophy of religion. And he opened his 1821 inaugural lecture on the philosophy of religion, delivered at the University of Berlin, with these words. The object of these lectures is the philosophy of religion, which in general has the same purpose as the earlier type of metaphysical science, which is called Theologia Naturalis. But unbeknownst to many, it was Ralph Cudworth who for the first time coined the term philosophy of religion, and wrote a great treatise on the philosophy of religion. So what are the main tenets of this group? So here we have Cudworth, and let's come to their tenets. Berkeley, in his Cyrus of 1744, writes that there are two sorts of philosophers. One placed body first in the order of things, others making all corporeal things to be dependent upon soul or mind. Now notice that Berkeley is drawing, via the learned Dr. Cudworth, on Proclus in his commentary on the theology of Plato, in depicting these two kinds of philosophers, the idealists and the materialists, the top-down thinkers and the bottom-up thinkers. Now, the Cambridge Platonists are top-down thinkers. they are idealists in this Berkeley sense of those who make all corporeal things to be dependent upon soul or mind. Their metaphysics attempts to explain the lower in terms of the higher, whereas the naturalist explains the higher in terms of the lower. And I put a few names of the tradition in which they belong. And in this, they follow what one could call an interior path. The first principle, the absolute or God, is not to be inferred from the facts or the very contingency of the cosmos, but is intuited or apprehended in consciousness or the structure of spirit. Now, the distinction between the spiritual and the material here is such that the transcendence of the divine is not to be conceived in materialistic terms as mere remoteness, and the refusal to envisage divine transcendence as out and up there, and the absolute as an apex of a cosmic pyramid, has sometimes been mistakenly interpreted as pantheism, and in fact it is the opposite. The enigmatic image of a God as a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere is the attempt to dispel materialistic or anthropomorphic conceptions of the first principle. Okay, so let me give you some instances of the Cambridge Platonists here. So Henry Moore, with the wonderfully entitled Democritus Platonicans, God is a circle whose circumference is nowhere, is circumscribed, whose centres each were set, but the low cusps of figure circular, whose compass is y-bound, but centres everywhere. The somewhat more prosaic Dr. Cudworth puts it rather differently, but the point is the same. Wherefore, although some novelists, not novelists in our sense, make a contracted idea of God as consisting of nothing else but will and power, yet his nature is better expressed by some of this mystical or enigmatical representation of an infinite circle, whose inmost centre is simply the radii, or rays, or expanded area thereof, an all-comprehending and immutable wisdom, the exterior periphery, or indeterminate circumference, omnipotent will or activity, by which everything without God is brought forth into existence. Right? So here we have two instances of this conception, this Neoplatonic conception of the first principle in both Moore and Cudworth. Here we have a 20th century idealist in his work, The Platonic Tradition in Anglo-Saxon Philosophy, where he traces the points whereby the Cambridge Platonists are the forefathers of a strand of idealism in the English-speaking world. And he sees this in three respects. First of all, their view of the divine principle in the world as the action not of an arbitrary will acting on it from without, but of an immanent will to good, whether conceived of as beauty, justice, or truth. The view of nature, which they pressed against mechanical systems, both of other times and their own. And thirdly, the theory of mind as an active participant in the process of knowledge. Now, notice how closely Cudworth comes to Muirhead's summary of the view. First, for making a perfect incorporeal intellect to be the head of all, the arche or the principle. Secondly, for resolving that nature as an instrument of this intellect does not merely act according to the necessity of material notions, but for ends and purposes. So some conception of nature as teleological. And thirdly, for maintaining the new naturality of morality. And lastly, for asserting the to ethemine, autexousie, or liberty from necessity. So a system of thought in which there is a first absolute principle where nature is conceived of as an image of that principle with a teleological dimension to it, and that freedom is part of the whole, and of course linked to freedom, responsibility. Okay. You might think that this is a fairly straightforward matter there. Here we have some metaphysicians of the 17th century living in Cambridge and deeply interested in Platonism. But this view has been challenged. Recently, a young historian, Dmitry Levitin, has questioned the existence of the Cambridge Platonists. Well, I'm not quite sure which part of the Cambridge Platonists might be objectionable. After all, most of them were really here. There were a couple of exceptions, but generally speaking, they were here. And their enthusiasm for Platonism is hard to question. Yet the claim has been gathering support and is widely discussed and respectfully cited by historians. So let's look at Levitin's claim in some detail. So here's the book, The Top Ancient Wisdom in the Age of the New Science. One did not have to be a Cambridge Platonist, or in any way connected to the supposed group, right, to be interested in ancient thought. As is shown throughout this book, i.e. his book, there was no such thing as a Cambridge Platonist attitude to history, philosophy. For a start, apart from Henry More, they were not professional philosophers. We might ask who was in a particular sense. But like most senior university fellows, theologians and philologists who used philosophy when it suited them. Secondly, their coherence and importance are predicated on the same 19th century Whig story that sought to trace a rationalist lineage for liberal Anglicanism, that terrible thing. The idea that they represent an anachronistic remnant of Renaissance humanism in an otherwise modern world is based on old assumptions about ancients and moderns and about traditions of Platonic syncretism we met earlier. Rafe Cudworth emerges not as an anachronistic Platonist, but as a cutting-edge European philologist. Most importantly, a huge number of scholars, natural philosophers and divines, were acutely interested in ancient wisdom without having anything to do with the Cambridge group. Okay, so in response to Levitin's last point that Cudworth was only a philologist, let's look at the learned doctor himself. He's sort of apologizing for himself here. We were necessitated by the matter itself to run out into philology and antiquity, as also in the other parts of the book. We do often give an account of the doctrine of the ancients, which, however, some over-severe philosophers, maybe the philosophy faculty, may look on fastidiously, or undervalue, or depreciate. Yet, as we conceived it often necessary, so possibly may the variety thereof not be ungrateful to others, and this mixture of philology throughout the whole sweeten and allay the severity of philosophy to them. The main thing which the book pretends to, in the meantime, being the philosophy of religion. So there he says it pretty clearly. What is he up to? It's the philosophy of religion, and the philology is to sweeten and allay. In fact, far from being only a theologian and philologist who uses philosophy occasionally, he defines philosophy as not a matter of faith, but reason. Men ought not to affect, as I conceive, to derive its pedigree from revelation, and by that very pretence seek to impose it tyrannically upon the minds of men, which God hath here purposely left free to the use of their own faculties, so that finding out truth by them, they might enjoy that pleasure and satisfaction which arises from them. So here we have a sort of theological justification for the importance of philosophy as an autonomous discipline. After all, if God gave us our reason, we should be allowed to use it. And look at the picture. Here's the frontispiece of the first edition of 1678, a copperplate engraving by Robert White, after design by the portrait painter Jan Baptist Gaspers, called The Six Greek Philosophers. It depicts two camps, the theists on the right, from the book's perspective, and the atheists on the left. So if you look here, you can see the theists, over whom we find the word victory, with a laurel wreath. And these are Aristotle, Pythagoras, and Socrates. The atheists, who have the word confusion over their heads in a broken wreath, are Strato, Epicurus, and Anaximander. And by the way, Spinoza, for Cudworth, is the new Strato, and Hobbes, the new Anaximander. And under the engraving, we have a quote from Plato, the book 10 of the Laws, where he's attacking atheism, and where he says, well, now, how can one argue for the existence of gods without getting angry? You see, one inevitably gets irritable and annoyed with these people, i.e. atheists, who have put us to the trouble, and continue to put us to the trouble, of composing these explanations. So, not only is it clearly the case that Levitin is wrong to deny that Cudworth is a philosopher. If he's not a philosopher, I don't know what he is. He's the source of a grand tradition of Platonic idealistic thought. And that's the reason why the 19th century figures draw so deeply on the 17th century. So let me turn to a favourite of mine, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Talking of the Cambridge Platonists, he says, the greater number were Platonists, so called at least, and such they believed themselves to be, but more truly Platonists. Thus Cudworth, Dr. Jackson, Henry Moore, John Smith, and some others. And then, just, if I may indulge you with some of Coleridge's wonderful prose, what they all wanted was a pre-Inquisition into the mind, as part organ, part constituent of all knowledge, an examination of the scales, weights and measures themselves abstracted from the objects to be weighted or measured by them. In short, a transcendental aesthetic, logic, and noetic. So where they went wrong is that they didn't reach the pinnacle of Kant, but they went a long way on the road there too. And another figure whom you will have passed when you came into this room, F.D. Maurice, another 19th century Platonist. There were English divines in their time who aimed at this reconciliation in a different spirit by a different method. Cudworth, Moore, Whichcote, Worthington, John Smith. You see the same names coming up again and again. Those men have sometimes been called Platonists, sometimes latitudinarians, who are eulogized by Burnet, whose influence was chiefly exercised in Cambridge and was felt most there, were not elected as preachers and never sought popular reputation of any kind. So, I think it's much more likely, rather than to see the Cambridge Platonists as some historiographical construction by broad church Anglicans of the 19th century to justify their own interests and obsessions, to see this as a living tradition. These are thinkers who recognize their kinship with their predecessors. And what is the kinship that they feel. Well, this is Platonism as systematic metaphysics and as a way of life. So, it's reasonable to talk about the Platonism of the Cambridge Platonists as essentially neo-platonic, because they're assuming that Platonism is a structure of thought, a system. And this is clear from the pictures we find again in the wonderful Inaugural Chapel, where we have depictions of two of the hero figures of the Cambridge Platonists, their predecessors, Origen and John Scott Eriugena. And Origen is holding periarchon on the sources, and Eriugena is periphysio on the divisions of nature. So these two figures represent the kind of systematic approach to Platonism that our figures are espousing. But they are also stressing the affective aspect of this philosophy, its experiential dimension. So I think our thinkers can be called philosophical contemplatives, very much in the tradition of both Plotinus and Origen. I want to say that this emphasis upon experience, ironically, is typical of this Platonizing tradition. Let me turn to the true intellectual system of the universe. I've always thought that's a spectacularly modest title for a book. And interestingly, the very term system here is the first time that system is not used to depict or to represent a system of rhetoric or politics or cosmology, but system in a metaphysical sense. So, and notice again the quotation from Origen's Against Celsus, and the reference to the Gymnasion te psyches he anthropine sophia telos de Pythea. So that human wisdom is an exercise for the soul, but divine wisdom is its end. And notice here that the true intellectual system of the universe, where all the reason of atheism is confuted and its impossibility demonstrated. Again, modesty wasn't really his forte. So, now one thing I think should be emphasized here, again, this is the confusing aspect of the term Platonism here for the modern reader, because Origen is absolutely crucial. For these thinkers, Origen is the very same Origen as the pagan Origen, sitting next to Plotinus, both warming the lecture hall seats of Ammonius Saccas in Alexandria. So Origen is integral for the Platonism of this group. And they're not fideists, but they're using Origen as the paradigm of a rational theologian rather than, say, Thomas Aquinas. And here, this is part of their belief that Christian theology needs a proper metaphysical structure against the modern philosophical criticisms of religious beliefs. So they're not drawing on the standard scholastic work of the university of the day, but they feel the need to expose the irrational bases of materialism and determinism, particularly Hobbes and Spinoza. So here we can see the wonderful Henry Moore, where, and above him you see Thomas Hobbes and Spinoza, It is enough for me here, mihi satis est, hic utiet alibi, to have cut the sinews of the Spinozan and Hobbesian cause. So what is motivating them is the challenge that materialism and determinism represents for their Platonic idealistic philosophy. And Cudworth too says what is necessary is a joining of metaphysics or theology together with physiology to make up one entire system of philosophy. Now, as I have emphasized, this is not just a metaphysical system, but the emphasis is very much upon the experience. And remember the great Platonic image, neo-Platonic image of the circle whose circumference is nowhere and center everywhere. The true metaphysical and contemplative man endeavors the nearest union with the divine essence that may be. Oh, sorry. Is that? No, sorry, I do apologize. This is the problem with a PowerPoint, where sometimes one can lose track between one's own talk and what's up here. Were I indeed to define divinity, I should rather call it a divine life than a divine science. It being something rather to be understood by a spiritual sensation. And notice the emphasis upon the experience here. So this is not a narrow rationalism, but by any verbal description. So it's a knowledge by acquaintance rather than knowledge by description. As all things of sense and life are best known by sentient and vital faculties, gnosis hekaston di homoetetos genetai, as the Greek philosopher hath well observed, everything is best known by that which bears a just resemblance and analogy with it. Or, further, we find the true and contemplative man endeavors the nearest union with the divine essence that may be. Kentron, kentro, synapsas, as Plotinus speaks, knitting his own centre, if he have any, unto the centre of the divine being. That image of God as the circle whose circumference is nowhere, centre is everywhere. This life is nothing else but God's own breath within him, and an infant Christ, if I may use the expression, formed in his soul, who is in a sense the shining forth of the Father's glory. Now, for those of you who are interested in medieval thought, this is the Eckhart school. So it's the birth of Christ in the soul coming through into the Cambridge Platonists. Henry Moore claimed that the reading of the German theology was crucial for his own intellectual development. And we find the same emphasis upon experience in the more sober Dr. Cudworth, who in his discussion of Plotinus tells us that Plotinus aimed at such a kind of rapturous and ecstatic union with Tohen and Tagaton, the first of the three highest gods, called the One and the Good, as by himself described towards the latter end of this last book, Iliad 6:9, where he calls it Epaphein, et Parousian, Epistemis, Ketona, et To, Hialton, Kentron, Toihoion, Panton, Kentro, Synaptein, kind of tactual union, a certain presence better than knowledge, and a joining of our own centre, as it were, with the centre of the universe. Now, I think it's clear the extent to which they're drawing on this notion of a metaphysics of the one that is very much present to the experience of the good life. And here we have a 20th century commentator who expounds, as it were, the theory that we have here. So A.E. Taylor, a pupil of T.H. Green, so coming out of the idealist tradition, but a very conscious Platonist. And I've put up a Cambridge figure here, again you will walk past, who was the assistant to Taylor in Edinburgh. And you find in Mackinnon, of course, and Murdoch, a very strong Platonic strand, although more critical of this Neoplatonic tradition than we find in Taylor. Now let's look at the passage in Taylor. And here, the key thought is that of conversion. The first step towards the conversion of the soul to God, as we learn from the Platonic Socrates, is that knowledge of self, which is also the knowledge of our own ignorance of true good. How do we pass from the discovery that we are in this miserable and shameful ignorance of the one thing it is incumbent on us to know? To apprehend the true scale, the scale of true good. How do we even get so far beyond our initial complete ignorance to be able to say that a good soul is immeasurably better than a good body, and a good body than an abundance of possessions? We know how the Augustinian doctrine, which is Christian as well as Platonic, answers the question. It does so by its conception, traceable back to the New Testament, that God himself is the lumen intellectus, a view which has been in substance that of all the classical British moral philosophers from Cudworth to Green, and seems in fact to be in principle the only solution of the difficulty. So here we have this in this account of the conversion of the self to its source, to its transcendent source, as the linking principle. Let me come to the issue of contemplation, imagination, and the sense of the sublime. Why I drew on those words from Gibbon, maybe an unlikely choice for my title. Here again is a more modern Platonist. And a rather splendid picture of the Fitzwilliam Museum. So Finlay, in his The Ascent to the Absolute, writes, the basic strength of Platonism lies in its appeal to our imagination, our understanding, and our sense of values. Now, this aspect of the imaginative dimension of the Platonic tradition may be lost on some. But if you consider the following passage from Cudworth in his True Intellectual System of the Universe, we find a striking anticipation of the romantic conception of the sublime. And nature itself plainly intimates to us that there is some absolutely perfect being, which, though not inconceivable, yet is incomprehensible to our finite understandings by certain passions which it hath implanted in us, that otherwise would want an object to display themselves upon, namely those of devout veneration, adoration, and admiration, together with a kind of ecstasy and pleasing horror. Now this pleasing horror sounds like Otto in the idea of the holy, the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. And here we have it in Cudworth, which, in the silent language of nature, seems to speak thus much to us, that there is some object in the world so much bigger and vaster than our minds and thoughts, that it is the very same to them that the ocean is to narrow vessels, so that when they have taken into themselves as much as they can thereof by contemplation, nota bene, and filled up all their capacity, there is still an immensity of it left without, which cannot enter in for want of room to receive it, and therefore must be apprehended after some other strange and mysterious manner, viz., by their being, as it were, plunged into it, and swallowed up, or lost in it. So there's a strong sense in which you can see the origins of the Romantic movement in the writings of Cudworth. So it's no surprise that Coleridge, when he was studying Cudworth, should come up with these beautiful lines in the Aeolian harp. And what if all of animated nature be but organic harps diversely framed, that tremble into thought as earthen sweeps plastic and vast, one intellectual breeze, at once the soul of each and God of all. So Cudworth's plastic nature, the God, who as in Plotinus, is pantachu kai udam, is everywhere and nowhere. I thought I'd end up with three of my favorite images. And they do have a Neoplatonic structure. So in the first, we have the magnificent Raphael's Ezekiel's vision. So this is Raphael's extraordinary depiction of that first book of the prophet Ezekiel, that image of the chariot that by the fathers was fused with the vehicle of Plato, that in the Jewish Kabbalah was associated with the vision. So here, as it were, is the theophanic dimension of the divine. Then here, this wonderful Titian, the flaying of Marsyas, we have, as it were, the principle of alienation. The sad fact that this world in which we dwell is a world of violence, a world of suffering, a world of evil. And how can we reconcile this experience of evil with the goodness, the beauty, the sublimity of its source? And then finally, the Raphael, the ecstasy of St. Cecilia, where we have the principle of conversion. So you can see in this remarkable depiction of these three contemplative figures of the Christian tradition. So we have St. Paul, of course known for his raptus. Then we have St. John, the beloved apostle, St. John of the Book of Revelation, of course, and Augustine, who was associated with the vision of God. Cecilia is looking at the heavens, and this is a tender aspect of the picture, although, broadly speaking, entirely irrelevant to my talk, but I'll mention it nevertheless. Mary Magdalene. So this tender but frail figure drawing us into the picture as we contemplate these powerful contemplative figures.
So, to conclude,
the starting point of the philosophy of religion is not Christian theology, but religion. It is the experience of the sacred in human life, together with the sad array of desecration, the sublime, and the presence of evil witnessed by the varieties of religious experience in human culture, from the earliest cave paintings to abstract expressionism, from the Vedas to Dostoevsky, from Pythagoras to Gandhi. The Barthian critique of religion, together with post-structuralist attacks on such essentialism, has generated, I think, a misplaced hostility to the idea of religion. My own research in the Hindu tradition, inspired by Julius Lipner in this faculty, was in the way of those latitudinarians of the 17th century who were eager to explore the rites and beliefs of the great cultures, whether those of ancient Babylonia, Egypt, the philosophies of the Turks, or the mystical Jewish Kabbalah. The philosophy of religion of the Cambridge Platonists was more open to non-Christian religion than most proponents in the field in the 20th century, with notable exceptions such as John Hick and Brian Hebblethwaite. The frequent appeals I've heard within these walls to a deus ex machina in the fideist tradition of Pascal, Kierkegaard, and Barth and their Anglo-American epigones has to be rejected, if only because it blocks the exploration of religions outside Christianity. The philosophy of religion is a philosophical activity. It's not a subsection of Christian apologetics. It may legitimately be used as Christian apologetics. And such an absolute is precisely the kind of limit of explanation that the analytic tradition of philosophy is often dismissed or critiqued as straying beyond the bounds of logic and experience. And the forgetting of this tradition of ancient Platonic speculation led to the Babylonian captivity of Heidegger's critique of ontotheology in postmodern theology and phenomenology. Talk of theology overcoming metaphysics, so fashionable when I arrived in the faculty, would have been frankly unfathomable to the Platonic divines of this university's greatest era. Some of the most ancient questions of philosophy remain the stuff of contemporary disputes. How can the mere clutter of phenomena form a harmonious whole? Or how does the apparently random concatenation of cause and effect reflect a catena or chain of being? Or how does the indiscernible unity of inner experience, I thought I'd bring a Henry Moore term in there, indiscernible, unity of inner experience mirror the unity of a law-like universe? Do developments in the study of the brain or neurophysiology raise new questions about human freedom? Or do the egregious horrors of the English Civil War or the tumult and brutality across the world in the last century reignite questions of good and evil? What are the metaphysical implications of postulating or denying values as transcendent verities? These metaphysical obsessions of the Cambridge Platonists remain urgent and pressing questions, and not least because the contemporary legacy of the two powerful models of Hobbes and Spinoza is evident, whether in the form of neo-Spinocism, in which any contingency disappears, or in the radical contingency of the purblind watchmaker, of materialist neo-Darwinian metaphysics. If anything, the sinews of the Hobbesian and Spinozan cause have become all the more powerful in the contemporary period, with the post-Darwinian theory of random mutation and natural selection on the one hand, and the deterministic component found in mechanical models of the DNA structure and function. And this has been reinforced by the widespread and corrosive nominalism derived more immediately from a heady cocktail of Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, presenting issues of class, race, or gender as the final arbiter in questions of intellectual inquiry for the life of the university more generally. Moving from the principle of the foundational transcultural sense of the sacred, the insufficiency of piecemeal mechanical explanations, and the capacity of the mind to be an organon of transcendence, all of which one can find in Coleridge or the Cambridge Platonists, that was what inspired me to write a trilogy on the imagination, with a desire to reject any crass dichotomy between rational judgment and imagination, linked to the belief in the capacity of finite images and symbols to unveil the infinite and the eternal. However, even if the religious imagination is endowed with a central role in the philosophy of religion, the logic and moral criticism of religious images is equally part of the task of the philosophy of religion. The religious imagination requires metaphysics in two respects. One positive: our metaphysical reflections can be inspired and shaped by images and symbols. Plato's cave, perhaps one of our most striking such images. Yet the rational critique of such images is equally necessary. It's chastening to recall in our self-esteem culture, and especially when giving lectures to tender-minded students, that false beliefs can be highly inspiring, and true beliefs can be profoundly dispiriting. The cool appraisal of consoling fantasies has been part of philosophy since Xenophanes. And if the cosmos is ultimately a heap of meaningless disjecta membra, then Nietzsche is right. That the Platonic idealistic metaphysics is a timid refusal to endorse the death of God. But while he was a scholar of literature who coined the phrase the anxiety of influence, no one could have more reason for such Oedipal anxiety than students of Plato. Yet Platonism, as a live philosophical option, has been infinitely fertile in fusing together the legitimate desire for the explanation of value and intelligibility while resisting rationalism of the narrow kind. Long may the endeavor to climb out of the cave and up the divided line continue. Long may we contemplate the good that ultimately overcomes evil and consecrates the finite and the defective. And long may we continue to revere the finite and transitory as a precious icon of the great I am that alone truly is.
There are some drinks outside.
Yes. Thank you all very much. The custom is the socialization continues outside the lecture theater. We're able to engage one another, and I'm sure our speaker more informally. But again, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Professor Hedley, for a wonderful talk that indeed fulfilled the promise of stimulating the imagination as well as talking about it. So thank you.